Over the past 24 hours, the Russians have managed to encircle the Ukrainian forces within the city of Kupiansk. The northern apartment complex area has now been encircled by the Russian forces, which leaves the majority of the Ukrainian forces fighting within the city with no stable supply line. The Russians are also storming the apartment complex area in the southern parts of the city. Gaining control over both apartment complex areas will allow the Russians to have full control over the western parts of Kupyansk, leaving just the eastern parts across the Encircled river line remaining under Ukrainian control. All throughout the front line, the Russians have made numerous advances with a single Ukrainian advance. The Russians managed to advance within the eastern outskirts of the Zaporizhia region along their first line of defense of the Zaporizhia and Pocrosk regions. Russians also managed to advance to the south of Pocrosk and in the northern flank, as well as some DRG activities in the area, where the Ukrainians have managed to recapture a position in the northern flank, with additional Russian advances to the south of Verge, where the Russians have managed to capture Kuznivka, and an additional Russian advance to the northwest of Leman. The Russians have also managed to blow up the remaining parts of the Leman bridge between Leman and Sloviansk, and with additional advances within the Kupiansk direction. Welcome back to another update. It is your host Union, and in this one, the Russians have managed to make numerous advances. Starting out in the Kupiansk direction, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the market area here in the southern parts of the northern section of the city itself, with additional advances in the southern parts where the Russians are advancing towards the railway area from the southern section, where they're looking to physically encircle the Ukrainian forces by cutting off the railway area. At the same time, the Russians are storming the mall area in the southern parts of the city and the apartment complex area in the southern part of the city. The Russians managed to advance here within the first patch area, as well as the outskirts of the industrial area, the tiny industrial area in the southern parts of the city, gaining control over the southwestern outskirts of it. The Russian activity is mainly pushed through the Moskovka direction, which suggests the Ukrainians have been kicked out of it, otherwise the Russians would not be able to sustain such a large push to the southern parts. And gaining control over the farm area as well as the apartment complex area in the eastern parts has allowed for additional advances in the eastern section as well. This has allowed the Russians to solidify their positions within Kupiansk, and now it is only a matter of time before they gain control over the remaining parts, as Ukrainian forces are now operationally encircled and risk a complete encirclement in the northern parts, and the southern apartment complex area has also been encircled. The majority of the Ukrainian forces within the city are now in a very disastrous position for the defense of it. Gaining full control over Kupiansk is a game changer for the situation here in this section of the front line, this isolated section of the front line, as the Russians would then have a road down to Encircled. If they also push across the Encircled river line, they'll be able to physically encircle the entire grouping of Ukrainian forces here to the east of the Encircled river line. Gaining control over this area will allow the Russians to significantly bolster their logistics and the offensive capabilities of their forces on both banks of the Encircled river line. Although the Ukrainians can significantly slow down Russian offensive capabilities and offensive operations with the use of FPV drones, even if they do not have a lot of manpower, it does not negate the fact that losing a lot of manpower, as is possible with an encirclement of the Ukrainian grouping of forces here east of the Encircled river line, it is not easily replaceable for the Ukrainians. It can instead create additional gaps in their lines of defense, which will allow faster Russian advances across the entire front line. It may even allow the Russians to launch wider offensive operations along the border areas, such as the Kharkiv-Belgorod border, to redirect Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians have been talking about a new counterattack similar to the Kursk incursion, which would also mean that some of these forces can be redirected to defensive operations instead of offensive operations, which they are trained for. This will limit the capacity of the Ukrainian offensive capabilities. Moving on to the northwest of Leman, the Russians have managed to gain control over parts of the first patch area, cutting off the road between Dobresheve and Novoselivka. This isolates the settlements of Novoselivka from Dobresheve in the northern road, but there is still the southern road that connects the two settlements as well as Yarova. This leaves just one road to connect the supplies from the northwest of Leman. This also means that the Russians can target all of their artillery fire FPV drone activity and their efforts on this singular road, which can act as a choke point for the Ukrainian supply lines. At the same time, the bridge to the southwest of Leman that connects Leman to Sloviansk was already destroyed. But as we can see with this footage here, the Ukrainians had already made a makeshift bridge next to the original bridge. The Russians bombed the bridge again, destroying the second span of the bridge here in the Leman direction. However, from a top-down view, we can see that the pontoon bridge is still standing. That means that the Ukrainians still have logistical capabilities across with the pontoon bridges, which is difficult to be targeted by bombs. The bridge itself has been completely destroyed, both the first and second spans of it. However, as long as the Ukrainians have pontoon bridges, they're still able to supply across the river line. We can confirm two things with this footage. The first one is that the Russians are continuously targeting the bridges. The second one is that the supply is not cut off, as the Ukrainians still have pontoon bridges across, and it's not limited to this area south of Leman. The river line is wide. There are many areas where the Ukrainians can establish similar pontoon bridges. However, the Russians are constantly striking them. That means one day it may be there, the next day it will be destroyed, and then a third day they'll make a new one. So the supply situation relying on these pontoon bridges across the river line is not a stable and sustainable way to supply the entire city of Leman. If the Russians are able to cut off the northwestern road, then it is limited to these pontoon bridges across the river line, and continuous Russian activity on the vast area to the north, northwest, and northeast of the city is going to be limiting the Ukrainian supply and defensive capabilities in the area. To the south of Siversk, the Russians have managed to gain control over the central parts of the settlement of Kupiansk. However, there are some trench networks on the outskirts of the settlement. There's also the southern residential area and northern residential area to the settlement, where fighting continues. We see with this geolocated footage the Russian presence across the river line following the capture of the settlement of Perezhne here to the east of the river line. The Russians are here working on gaining full control over the highway area, as well as the surrounding fortifications. This will allow them to secure the southern supply route into Siversk through Svenivka and Pocrosk here on the southern flank of the town. This is to bypass the fighting over the town itself to the surrounding settlements. Moving on to the northern flank of Pocrosk, the Russian DRGs are active here to the east of Sofievka and south of Novopavlivka. Following the capture of the southern bank of the river line, the Russians have started moving in small infantry groups, mainly for reconnaissance and sabotage, where they are moving along the forest lines to get closer to the supply lines leading into Sofievka, as well as through Novopavlivka. This is to gain control over the settlements and to cut off the supply routes that lead into these locations. Ukrainians currently have 3 supply lines into Sofievka, which then connects down towards Shekhove through this singular road. The northwestern supply route goes through the eastern flank of Kocherevya, which the Russians have fire control of with their presence along the forest line to the west of the road. There is the northern road here to the north of Toretsk, which the Russians have no control over, but FPV drone activity reaches over it and allows the Russians to strike it. Similar case with the northeastern supply route. The Russians are here working on cutting off the northeastern supply route and the western supply route, which both being cut off will allow the Russians to concentrate their FPV drone activity to the north of Toretsk and having operational fire control over the roads leading through, and including the settlements of Sofievka, Shekhove, and Volodymyrivka here in the south. The Russians have also managed to regain full control over Novotoretsk, kicking the Ukrainian forces out of the settlement, while the Ukrainians have managed to regain control over Doreshne, which secures the positions on the western flank of Nikhonorivka and the supply line into the settlement. But the Russians have also managed to secure Boykivka, which means that the Ukrainian attempt to completely encircle the Russian forces in the north has been disrupted, and the Russians have yet again secured their supply lines towards the Kocherevya direction, and with the capture of Vilna, they are looking to continue their offensive operations to regain control over Nikhonorivka, Doreshne, Ivanivka, and Novoshekhove to secure the western flank as well, while they're also working on securing the northern flank, including Toretsk, Sofievka, Shekhove, and Volodymyrivka. To the south of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Chunishina Following a long period of it being a kill zone, the Russian capture of the fortified positions to the west of the railway allowed them to cut off the main supply line, gain fire control over the supply lines, which allowed them to then secure Tunishina. And with the recent activity within Novopavlivka, it's only a matter of time before they gain control over that as well, and the Russians continue storming the remaining parts of the Shakhtarsky district. Gaining control over this will allow the Russians to have full control over the E50 highway connecting to the central parts of the city from the eastern flank, and a lot of positional fighting continues within the city itself in the central and western parts. As for the eastern outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region, the Russians continued offensive operations along the first line of defense and to the south of it. Following their foothold gained in the Poltavka direction, the Russians continued offensive operations along the first lines, where it manages to gain control over the eastern flank of Okhonotyshne, which is located on the eastern bank of the Yanchur River line. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the eastern bank of the Yanchur River line, which will allow them a stable flank for offensive operations taking place from the south, with fire support from the Russian forces east of the river line. The Russian forces attacking from the south will have proper support to limit the casualties they'll take during the operations and speed up the process as well. With the fighting taking place along the first line of defense as well, the Russians are now flanking the remaining fortifications east of the Yanchur River, these two fortified positions that remain, getting control over which will allow the Russians to have fire control over the next fortifications here to the north of Okhonotyshne, where we see that the first line of defense is still to the north of Poltavka. That means there is no strategic significance to the capture of Poltavka. The main process will be from the northern flank through Novovasilivske, Novomykolaievka, Okhonotyshne, and the eastern bank of the Yanchur River line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.